Senate Bill 161, Highway Signage Amendments. Now you may notice here that I have one sign in particular. That's because this bill relates to one sign. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration because there were some other things that were put into the bill that make it a little bit more general. But the interesting thing is this bill actually started out for one sign, then it actually wound up being about another sign, and then some other things were added into it. So what this bill does with regard to the individual sign provisions is, under the state code, you have on-premise and off-premise signs. And an off-premise sign is considered to be a sign that's advertising something that doesn't take place on the property where the sign is located. You know, most typical example is billboards. Well, in the case of this particular development, which is in Utah County, Lehigh area, their sign is located on a parcel of property that is not directly connected to the rest of where all of the shops are. There's actually a highway in between, and I think a railroad right-of-way and a couple of other things that separate that property from the main development of the property where all the shops are. And so technically under the code, it's an off-premise sign because it's not on the same property where the activity is taking place. And so what this bill does is it actually then says, you know, you can consider this to be, puts in some new definitions of what they call a unified commercial development and some other things, and it says a unified commercial development, even if it's separated by a highway or railroad right-of-way, and some other things can be considered to be part of the, all can be considered like one parcel. And the bill goes on to say some specific, more specific things like in a community that has a resort zone, in a community that has, I mean, when you get through all of that, it really relates to one sign. And that's this one. And so that particular bill does that. Now, UDOT has added did get a couple of other things added into this. So the corridor away from state highways that their regulations for outdoor advertising apply is expanded in this bill from 300 feet to 660 feet. Okay? So it's a little broader. They did get that in there. And there are some provisions in there with regard to enforcement. Apparently there have been some issues with how certain signs have occurred, and so one of the enforcement provisions that it states in there, it says that it now includes on-premise signs that may occasionally advertise something that's not on the premises. This happens with electronic signs that are becoming more prevalent now. So you'll have a company or a business that gets an on-premise sign, electronic, that advertises their business. But as you know, electronic signs are easily changeable. And so what some businesses have started doing is they're selling time on their sign. And so they advertise other things. So there was a real question now arising, is this an on-premise sign or an off-premise sign? And it's really kind of both. And so the question really was, can you enforce it as an off-premise sign? So in this bill, it now says even an on-premise sign that advertises occasionally for off-premise businesses is considered an off-premise sign. Okay, so what that basically means is businesses can't do that anymore. They can't sell time to other off-premise businesses to advertise on their electronic sign and still be within the requirements of the state code with regard to those signs. And then there were some enforcement provisions in there that apparently that UDOT had been having some trouble with in enforcing, and those are in there as well. So won't bore you with the detail on that. The Olean Walker Housing Loan Fund amendments, you would think, wow, what has that got to do with our local land use planning and zoning? Well, there's this. This bill was primarily used for the funding of homeless facilities. Patrick, you can probably explain this a lot better than I can, and I don't know that we need to get in a lot of the detail, but they're through some of the funding that the state was making available and other sources were making available for homeless services, primarily in Salt Lake County, but I guess it's not limited to Salt Lake County. It could be used elsewhere. So that's primarily what this bill did, is it talked about those funding sources and the funding provisions for those homeless services. But the bill also does something else. It says that a municipality may not prohibit a homeless services facility from operating year-round. That's targeted at one community, really, right now anyway, at least, and that's Midvale, where they have the winter-only shelter. And as part of the negotiation and the deals that were struck amongst all of the communities that were involved in this homeless services this year at the legislature, that was one of the I guess, the requirements or the ideas that came out of there, was that with the idea of trying to disperse the homeless services out of downtown Salt Lake City to other locations, you already had this one in Midvale that was operating in the winter. Make it so that it can operate year-round and not just in the winter. And so that provision went in there, but it applies to all municipalities. It does not apply to counties. So that's the interesting part of it. Maybe sometime they'll come back and amend that, but it does apply to municipalities. Now let's talk about some of the other planning issue bills. House Bill 10 on initiative and referendum amendments. What this did, it's not a direct impact on local land use issues, but in the state code with regard to referendums and initiatives, it does say that a local law includes such things as master plans. It's interesting that the code uses the term master plan because that's not what they're called in LUDMA. They're called general plans in LUDMA, but this provision calls it master plans, community master plans, and land use ordinances and comprehensive zoning actions. Those are included as what's called a local law. This bill expands that and now says that a local law is any legislative action taken by the legislative body. So all of that now throws it into the realm of being able to be what they call either referred or, well, it's primarily on referendums because it's dealing with that. So, I mean, it's kind of a little bit of an arcane thing, but now it really, any action that the local legislative body takes, including general plans, land use regulations, and comprehensive zonings, are subject to referendums. Now those land use issues, they already have been, but this just kind of broadened the category for doing that. House Bill 168, transportation funding modifications. This just made a clarification in some of the transportation funding provisions in the state code, clarifying that the money in these could be used for things like trails, parking structures, parking facilities, non-motorized vehicle storage facilities, other things than what you would normally associate with being roads. So this particular bill just makes it clear that the funds in there can be used for some of these other kinds of things, which there have been some question. And so I think a number of communities are pretty happy to see that. House Bill 232, scenic byway amendments. This was mischaracterized by the media. Media doesn't do that, right? They're right on. They get it right every time. This was kind of touted as being the bill that allows billboards in beautiful rural areas. This was a bill that was actually came up last year in the legislative session. There was extensive negotiation that went on with regard to this bill, and then both the League and UAC were okay with it, and then it ran out of time in last year's legislative session and didn't get passed. So it came up again this year. What this provides for, what it allows, is that many of you are familiar with scenic byways. A lot of times those scenic byways will go through like a community or a town, and maybe areas just either side of that community town. It's maybe a stretch to call that area scenic, right? But they're part of the scenic byway, and so all of the scenic byway regulations apply, including the restrictions on signs and billboards. This bill allows for a process by which either the local governing body, that's the city council or the county commission, county council, can declare an area, and there's some limits on how big that area can be, as not being scenic, and therefore then allowing for signs to be located on that section. Now, people are saying, wow, you know, that's really kind of opening the whole process, but there's a process in there as well that if you have people who disagree with that, as saying that that's not a scenic portion, and people saying, yeah, it really is, there's a process by which it goes to the Scenic Byways Commission and then even to an administrative law judge to go through this whole process, and you have to prove by some set of characteristics that it's not scenic. If somebody objects to that and thinks that that's not appropriate to allow that area to be designated as non-scenic. So really the whole meat of this provision is to allow some sections of those scenic byways that are ostensibly not scenic in communities or whatever, that they can have signs on them. Okay, let's move this along. HB 248, municipal disconnection. This, in order to de-annex or disconnect from a municipality, it requires a signature of the property owners. The property owner saying, I want to be out of this community. There are communities in our state that have federal lands within them, and in some cases it makes sense for them not to be within the boundaries of a municipality for a variety of different reasons. The federal government will not sign such a petition to de-annex. So under our state code, we're stuck. What this bill does is it allows a mayor to submit a petition for disconnection, just with the mayor's signature. And so that's intended and aimed at federal lands, so allowing federal lands to be de-annexed out of communities. House Bill 276, again, this is with regard to the public lands issue. This was the bill that is really pretty long and extensive and establishes a whole structure for management and planning of public lands on the theory or on the idea that at some time all of those federal public lands will be turned over to the state of Utah. And so this bill is one of those things, you know, that says if this happens, we're all ready. We're ready. We can do it. And so this bill was passed and establishes that structure. It's very heavy on planning, which is interesting to see some of our rural legislators that were so supportive of a heavily planning bill. But that's what this particular bill relates to. And it isn't really going to mean anything unless and until those federal lands are turned over to the state of Utah, which anybody want to give odds on that? House Bill 318, point of the Mountain Development Commission Act. This is an interesting bill just in terms of it establishes a commission whose charge is to look at the area in South Salt Lake County, northern Utah County. It happens to be the area where the state prison land currently are. So that's, I think, one of the impetuses to have this bill happen, but it establishes this commission that includes state legislators, governor's representatives, and local officials to do extensive work on looking at the growth and development of this area. And the idea being, I guess, that this area is becoming a big, important piece of the state's economy. The future growth and development of that area is important to the state, and therefore they want to take a look at what may be needed in terms of infrastructure investment and transportation investment, as well as just how that whole area is going to grow in the future. State's never done anything like this before. This has always generally been a local function. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out and whether they do anything like this elsewhere in the future. But it's kind of interesting to see the state taking an interest and a role in this in the future. Now, when you ask a state legislator about this, they say, well, it's because we have 700 acres of state land there, and it's important to plan and get the maximum benefit out of that 700 acres. And that's true. But it's broader than that, much broader than that, the area that it's being looked at. This bill comes with $800,000 to do the work and the studies on this. So it's quite interesting, and we'll see what happens with other things like this in the future. Many of you may recall there was a bill passed last year also that for Salt Lake County allowed for the creation of what's called a Mountainous Planning District, which for the Wasatch Mountains allowed Salt Lake County, and Salt Lake County has created this Mountainous Planning District and established a Mountainous Planning Commission. And they now exist and they're working. But that particular bill, because there were suspicions and uncertainties about it last year, it had a sunset clause in it. And the sunset was for July of this year. So Salt Lake County has done all of the work to set this up, and they're getting going, but unless the legislature took some action, it would have gone away at the end of June or July of this year. So this bill ostensibly was to get that sunset provision removed. Now that it's up and working, there's still a lot of questions and issues and some distrust from communities, from businesses and others. So in this particular bill, what it did is it extends that deadline for another year to 2017. And then there's also some provisions that were put in there which would allow, under certain circumstances, for some annexation of the mountainous planning district area to occur into communities. And then it also structures a process whereby for some of those planning commission seats, the county mayor and the county council have to consider nominees from some of the communities that are adjacent to the mountainous area. So a little bit of politics going on here, but so that bill has happened, and we're working through those issues in Salt Lake County. It's Salt Lake County bill, but we've received interest from some other counties saying, hey, tell us how this works. We might be interested in doing something like this in our counties. So it's an interesting concept. We'll see what happens to it in the future. House Bill 431, affordable housing revisions. What this does is that it says the transit agency must adopt policies regarding transit-oriented development and include in those policies provisions for affordable housing. It doesn't mandate that there be affordable housing or that there even be transit-oriented development, but it just says that those transit agencies must consider and adopt policies that relate to that. So kind of an interesting deal that the legislature would be interested in that. Senate Bill 80, infrastructure funding amendments. What that particular bill does is it calls for the moving of some funds out of transportation into water infrastructure. And there's a process by which that'll happen over a period of years. And when UDOT was asked, they said this would not have any effect on currently planned projects. But of course, in the long run, it will have an effect on the total amount of money that's available for transportation. And there were some arguments made as to why that should occur. What I just kind of find interesting about this is last year, we went through this whole process of raising the gas tax and putting in place the local option for transportation on the argument that we really have a big need in transportation infrastructure and we need more money. So great, so those things were passed last year, and this year we're providing for transfer of monies from transportation to somewhere else. So, Senate Bill 123, Office of Licensing Amendments. What this bill says is that the Office of Human Services Licensing, when asked by a local community, must provide them a list of all of the human service facilities that are permitted within those communities, in that particular community. I don't know. I'm guessing that's just when you have things like group homes or resource or recovery facilities or other things like that that are being proposed in the communities oftentimes want to know what's already there, and I think that's just kind of aimed at allowing this to happen, that they have to. I don't know that the office is not providing that information now, but this requires that they have to provide that information when they're asked. So keep that in mind. And then Senate Bill 150, Metro Township Amendments. As many of you are aware, in Salt Lake County, last year, the bill that was passed, and then with the elections that happened, there's now a new local government entity called Metro Townships. And just the mechanics of getting that all up and running, the votes took place last November. They're being structured now and put in place, and then how all of this is going to operate. Where they're going to get their ability for staffing, the funding for that, and then also to protect them from annexations until such time as they're actually in existence.